Hi, Carl.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks. How about you?
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV and its new sister channel, Meaning of Life TV. You are Karl Giberson. You teach at Stonehill College now, and you are the author of this very interesting book. It's about Adam, the biblical Adam. It is called Saving the Original Sinner, How Christians Have Used the Bible's First Man to Oppress, Inspire, and Make Sense of the World. A lot of interesting stuff in this book, a lot of big themes floating around, certainly including the question of how traditional religion reconciles itself, or as the case may be, fails to reconcile itself, to modern science. You open the book with the case, and a little, I guess, kind of a preface with the case of a professor who was fired from an evangelical college for saying, look, the genetic evidence suggests that this guy Adam could not have existed. And that actually parallels your own story vaguely. You left an evangelical college. I don't think you were fired, but I think you got the sense that increasingly your acceptance of the theory of natural selection and your tendency to talk about it was not welcome there. And so you're now happily ensconced at a Catholic college that's more open to critical inquiry. And I want to talk about all this stuff before we finish, your own experiences and the larger science and religion question. But let's start talking about Adam himself. And, one thing I hadn't completely appreciated until I read this book is how important Adam is to Christians and why. Adam's not part of the New Testament, at least not very prominently, and so we don't associate him with Christianity nearly the way we associate Jesus with Christianity. But as you point out, Adam became crucial in the early years of Christianity in kind of, in a certain sense, establishing the theological significance of Jesus, right?
Yes, that's right. I mean, Adam became ensconced in a theological system that included Jesus as one central part and Adam as the other. Adam brings sin into the world, Jesus takes it away, and those two things go together in a way that, in the minds of many people, are inseparable.
Right. And that's why you say, when at an evangelical college a professor starts saying that Adam didn't exist, this is no small matter. It's not just a question of questioning the literal accuracy of the scriptures. It's a lot deeper than that for Christians. And I think you think this is going to become a big issue, a bigger issue than it has been, the question of the existence of Adam for Christians, right?
Yeah, this is the so-called red line, I think, that in the kind of liberal wing of evangelical Christianity, where people are taking science seriously, they're sort of able to kind of go as far as they want theologically, but they've got to stop before they lose Adam. And so it's kind of okay to get away from biblical literalism. It's okay to get away from the idea that God created everything in 6 days. It's okay to get away even from the idea that human beings were specially created and not evolved. I mean, all those things are kind of negotiable, but some kind of an Adam figure in history is not negotiable for most evangelicals, no matter how liberal they are.
Okay, and let's flesh out this connection to Jesus a little bit. I mean, we now take for granted the idea that Jesus, saves us from our sins or redeems us, that this is the Christian belief, I mean. But as you point out, this is, more than a phrase. I mean, it's a whole theology that was worked out, so far as we can tell, by the Apostle Paul, right? And at first, the earliest New Testament writings in which this idea occurs are the letters of Paul, which, for that matter, are the earliest New Testament writings, right? Those are the first books of the New Testament to have actually been put into writing, were the letters of Paul.
Yes, and I mean, Paul's considered by most Christians to kind of be the theological architect of Christianity, that Jesus provides a kind of moral center with the teachings that are inspirational and the kind of the Sermon on the Mount, for example, may be the heart of Christian ethical teaching, and then St. Paul provides the theological structure into which you insert Jesus and tells us why Jesus is important. So Paul's teaching sort of is the theology of Christianity for many people.
Mm-hmm. And the idea is that if we need someone like Jesus to die for our sins, well, it must be the case that we have something to pay for to begin with. That we have that there are that we have this sinful nature or sins we've committed or whatever that need redeeming, and that's where Adam came in, and this was Paul's innovation, right?
Yes, this is Paul's innovation. I mean, Jesus never described his role in quite that way. So when Jesus dies, the disciples are demoralized, and there's a big question about, well, what's going on here? What's happened here? And then the story of the resurrection sort of rejuvenates hope in what Jesus was all about. But there's still a question. Well, but what did this mean? Like, why did this happen? So, Paul's looking at the incarnation and saying, okay, God became incarnate in the human race in the form of a humble first century Palestinian Jew. And then all this terrible stuff happened. The crucifixion and so on was a horrible, terrible death. And so, like, what's going on? Why did God's incarnate Son have to suffer that way? There must be some gigantic, cosmically significant problem that God was solving in this particular way. And that is how Paul connected Jesus to Adam. That Adam has brought sin into an otherwise perfect creation, and Jesus will take that sin away.
Mm-hmm. And this doctrine, as it evolved, came to be called the doctrine of original sin, hence the title of your book, Saving the Original Sinner. Original sin has more than one meaning, right, in common parlance. I mean, well, you tell me, what do you take the current Christian meaning of original sin to be?
Yeah, the current Christian meaning of original sin is the inheritance that every human has from Adam and Eve. That God cursed the human race. God cursed all of creation, and the sinful nature that Adam acquired when he sinned is passed on genetically to all of his offspring. And we inherit that. So little babies are born with this original sin.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not. It has nothing to do with our character, whether we're a good person or a bad person. It has nothing to do with anything that we've actually done. It's our state. It's our sort of moral DNA, if you will, that we just come into the world with this sin, and this sin separates us from God. And this is why the practice of infant baptism has been practiced for such a long time, to sort of make it possible for a baby, should they die during childbirth or shortly after, that they can go to heaven.
Mm-hmm. Now, it might strike a lot of people as strange that we all are held accountable for Adam's action, right? I mean, it's like he is the one in this story who, of his own volition, sinned, and then the rest of us just were born, and we automatically inherit the sin, is the idea. I mean, you might think it would make more sense for me to need redeeming if I have chosen to sin, if there's something that I am personally culpable for, right?
Yes, and I mean, of course. I mean, and Christians have always wrestled with that. I mean, there's always been this sense of great injustice that, like, how in the world can a newborn infant that isn't baptized, if they should die of whooping cough at 3 months of age, they go to hell forever because they were born with original sin. I mean, this seems colossally unfair. So the solution to that, however, is kind of solving another problem. And the other problem that Christianity has to deal with is, why is the world so filled with suffering and hardship? And if God made a perfect world, why is the world so imperfect? So it's a kind of a pick your poison. I mean, we either need to kind of impute all of the suffering and bad design and misery of the world to God's intention in the original creation, or we have to find some other origin for it. So the other origin is to say, okay, it was Adam who sinned.
Mhm. So to solve the problem of evil, to reconcile the existence of evil with the idea of an omnipotent and benevolent God, you have to say that, look, it's the humans who screwed it up. It could have been God made it possible for everything to be wonderful, and then our species messed things up. And Paul does that by blaming Adam. We might think it would make more sense to say we are all screwing it up, on a daily basis of our own free will. But whatever, that you kind of had to. The problem of evil dictated that you blame this on humans, and then Paul went further than that in creating. I think, as you put it, he made Jesus and Paul bookends in a story of salvation or something like that, right?
Yes, so that sin comes into the world sort of through the door called Adam, and sin leaves the world through the door called Christ, and those sort of side by side doors are at the heart of the Christian understanding of the world.
Okay, and so this is why the story has such high stakes from a Christian point of view, the story of Adam. And I gather that the among the reasons that the existence of Adam is getting talked about more, including in Christian circles, is because of DNA evidence. I mean, you might think that, look, a long time ago, people would have said, this Adam story is kind of dubious in light of the theory of natural selection itself. But I gather that some of this DNA evidence puts a finer point on the argument that the story of Adam is mythical.
Yeah, it was always possible when the first evidences began to suggest that the biblical Adam may not have been historical. It was always possible to find some scenario where you could kind of preserve the sort of the central part of the story, because the only thing that Adam really needs to do is to bring sin into the world. Like, he doesn't need to live in the Garden of Eden. He doesn't need to live 6,000 years ago. He doesn't need to be the parents of Cain and Abel or the husband of Eve. I mean, he doesn't have to do any of that stuff. I mean, the only theological thing that Adam needs to do is provide a source for sin. So a lot of people look at the story in Genesis and said, okay, well, it didn't happen exactly this way. Adam lived in Africa. Adam lived hundreds of thousands or 1,000,000 years ago, or Adam was not the first man. He was a man that God selected from the first human tribe, or something like that. But you create some scenario where you keep this theological functionary in history, but you kind of are flexible with everything else in the story. So as long as you could do that, it was kind of okay. But the DNA evidence just makes it so hard now to kind of look back and say, okay, there's just no way to get the entire human gene pool today from one man and one woman that lived a few thousand years ago. Like, it just can't possibly be. And in fact, it's not possible to get the current gene pool from just two humans. There appears to be a solid genetic argument for there being at least 1,000 humans in the original tribe. So the sort of mathematical impossibility of getting all of the genes that we have today from two individuals makes it so people are saying, look, we can't keep reinventing atoms to accommodate new science. We've just got to let him go.
Although I was thinking that not so long ago, scientists were, I think, in tracing mitochondrial DNA maybe, were arguing that they had figured out roughly where and when the original, in fact, it was called the Eve hypothesis, the original, the mother of all humankind. They were kind of using that phrase, I thought, at least on the female side of the lineage.
Yeah, so the mitochondrial DNA all came from that particular woman, but there's a lot more genes in the genome than just the ones that came from mitochondrial Eve.
Right.
Okay. And there's a lot more genes than just came from the Y chromosome atom. I mean, you can kind of show mathematically, if you take all of the parents and start tracing common ancestry back. Like, eventually you have to get back to one parent. I mean, you and I would go back, 20 generations or something like that, and then we'd have the same great grandfather, and then you and Michael Jordan would have to go further back, and so on. But eventually you would do that, and so there's no problem with kind of going back and saying, okay, here's the person that represents a common father of everybody. But there's a whole lot more genes around then that quickly intermingle into the gene pool. Mm-hmm. I mean, you don't only have the genes from your grandfather. I mean, you've got all kinds of other genes as well.
Okay, and you do see signs that this is becoming more of a point of friction within the evangelical community. I mean, the story that you start with is a guy who was fired by, I guess, Calvin College for arguing from the genetic evidence that maybe Adam didn't exist. But there are a number of such cases, or at least signs of tension. I don't mean firings.
Yeah, no, there are a lot of cases, and it's very interesting when you look at the sort of common response to this conversation. You can go back to Wheaton College in Illinois, the kind of flagship, if you will, of the evangelical colleges, and I mean this erupted there in the 1990s, and so they decided, well, we have to clarify what we think. So instead of just leaving it sort of loose and open, letting the biology faculty and the Old Testament scholars kind of come up with whatever scenario they want, they clarified. And the clarification that they produced was that evolution is acceptable as a belief, but it has to stop at humans. And human beings have to be specially created. There has to be an original Adam and original Eve. That has to be sort of separated. And there was a conversation started just a few years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, at Bryan College in Dayton, Tennessee, named after the famous Scopes prosecutor. And that conversation ended up exactly the same way, that they clarified what was a kind of vague commitment to the creation of human beings and said, no, it has to be an original, unevolved Adam and Eve. And a lot of faculty ended up having to leave there. The case of John Schneider that you mentioned at Calvin College was another one. And then literally just within the last month, the Missionary Church, which is an evangelical denomination, not a fundamentalist denomination, but an evangelical denomination that sponsors Bethel College in Illinois, they clarified their statement to state that you have to believe that Adam and Eve were specially created, and that no faculty at Bethel College can hold other views or be a part of any organization that does so. And that ended up with a professor named Jim Stump, who was working with the Biologos Foundation. He ended up retiring from Bethel as a part of that because he could no longer sort of sign onto that view. So the response is almost the same every time. It's like the conversation arises, it calls for clarification, and the clarification always ends up being, we have to get rid of people that deny the historical Adam.
So are evangelicals losing kind of an appreciable amount of brain power? I mean, are a lot of intellectuals being drummed out of the core, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of intellectuals who are leaving because the way the conversation is going now, this clarification is moving this theological center of gravity to the right. So most evangelical communities are getting more conservative. They're getting a little bit closer to fundamentalism, and they are making it very, very difficult for intellectuals to kind of stay a part of those communities.
Mm-hmm. And is your working definition of fundamentalism is somebody who believes in the literal accuracy of the Scripture, the inerrancy of the Scripture, whereas not all evangelicals don't have to do that to be evangelicals? Yeah,
so I mean, there's a kind of a spectrum that goes from the biblical literalism, the young Earth creationism of Ken Ham, and so on at one end of the spectrum. They're biblical literalists that basically believe that God inspired the Bible word for word as it's written, and we should read it in a simple, literal way. That's what we call fundamentalism. What we call evangelicalism kind of includes that, but it goes all the way over to somebody like Francis Collins, for example, probably the most well-known sort of liberal evangelical.
He headed the Human Genome Project.
Yeah, headed up the Human Genome Project, currently the head of the National Institute of Health and so on. I mean, arguably one of the most important scientists in the world. And he's an evangelical Christian. He does not read the Adam and Eve story literally. He's not a biblical literalist and so on, but he still would maintain the general evangelical commitment to a very sort of high view of Scripture as the inspired Word of God. He would be very careful about imputing any sort of error to anything in the Scriptures and so on.
And that's what makes him evangelical as opposed to a theologically liberal Christian.
Yeah, I mean, theologically liberal Christians, such as you might find in the Episcopal Church or the Methodist Church and so on. I mean, many of them will not impute any kind of divine inspiration to the Scriptures. I mean, the Bible doesn't have kind of a special authority because God made sure that the writers didn't make any mistakes. They're far more likely to approach the Scriptures as in a scholarly way. They might see the Scriptures as being an authentic account of God's interaction with the human race, but they would not be inclined to use scriptural authority to argue against the findings of historians about history or scientists about science.
Okay, and then what about your own case? I mean, how did you begin to run afoul of some powers that were at least at your own institution, which I think was Eastern Nazarene College?
Yes. Well, the story in all these cases is quite similar. That is, as long as a professor stays in the classroom, you're usually okay. Almost all of these institutions that we're talking about are far more liberal than the denominations to which they're attached. In fact, you can usually think of the liberal arts college attached to any denomination as kind of defining the very, very liberal wing of that tradition. And as long as you simply teach students in the classroom, you're okay. I mean, in large part, it's because people don't know exactly what you're doing, and they make the assumption that, oh, I go to a Baptist church, this is a Baptist college, they're probably teaching exactly the same thing, so if I send my son there, he will just learn at a higher level what he's learned in Sunday school and church his whole life. And so there's just a default assumption that that's what's going on. And that actually works very well politically. But when you start to publish, and so you become widely known, and so lots of people are now reading you, then you run into problems. And in all the cases that we've talked about, the person who lost their job or decided to leave, feeling pressure to kind of abandon the tradition, in all those cases, it wasn't kind of because of what they're doing in the classroom, it was because what they were writing. You can always point to a book. This book created the problem.
And in your case, you wrote a book called Saving Darwin about evolution in Christianity and prospects for reconciling them. Is that what got you into trouble, or what?
Yeah, I mean, so Saving Darwin got me into trouble, and then Saving Darwin was a popular enough book that I was getting invitations to write in lots of other places, and so my work began to appear on the Huffington Post and the Daily Beast and Salon.com, and I did an op-ed in the New York Times, and so on. And all of those things bring your work to the attention of people who normally would have no clue what you were thinking. So as soon as you lay yourself out in print like that, you become the subject of a lot of unwelcome scrutiny.
And what were the specific things you said that got you into the most trouble?
Well, like for instance, arguing that Adam and Eve weren't historical. That was a serious problem, and I would get letters sometimes from Nazarene pastors giving me a numbered list of specific questions that they wanted me to answer, and I mean I usually responded, but I never answered their questions because I knew all they're looking for was the opportunity to get me on the record on some hot button items, and then they would take these to some person in authority and say, okay, we've got a professor now, he doesn't think that Adam and Eve are real, we've got to get rid of him there. And so this is sort of how these witch hunts kind of go, that somebody, it's usually a very influential pastor, sometimes a conservative donor, there's some group, somebody like that puts pressure on an institution because they've got a liberal faculty member.
Okay. And
I should add that in my case, I mean, as I became more and more attuned to this conversation, I began to realize that science simply needs to be defended with greater vigor within evangelicalism, that we can't just go on like thinking that the age of the earth is an open scientific question, and that some people think it's thousands of years and others think it's billions, and there's a controversy in the scientific community. I mean, we can't keep thinking that way. I mean, we've got to get past that. But in most of evangelical Christianity, the age of the earth is an open question. I mean, that's astonishing that it's an open question. We have to get past whether common ancestry and evolution by natural selection is true or not. I mean, it is true. I mean, we can no longer kind of think of that as just one of the options on the table. And so the more sort of vigorous your defense of science, the more enemies that you make, and then eventually your enemies coalesce around you and make enough trouble that has happened to Galileo. You get some kind of an inquisitorial proceeding, and then you're gone.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you think there's any validity to the concern on their part, on the part of conservative evangelicals, that, this is just the camel's nose under the tent? Okay, maybe you could give up on Adam and keep your theology largely intact, call it an allegory. You could even, in fact, and we should talk about this in a second, you could say this is in some ways an allegory for evolution, for how a sinful nature came to be embedded in human nature. But at the same time, this whole path of critical inquiry, what part of Christian theology ultimately isn't endangered by this, right? I mean, isn't that to some extent they're feeling like, okay, it's true, you're not going to find mitochondria or genetic evidence to support an argument against the divinity of Jesus, but still this same kind of critical scrutiny leads to skepticism about various things, leads us to start treating the Bible as just another accretion of cultural lore as you find in other religious traditions and so on, right? I mean, to some extent, the fear must be that this is a slippery slope, right?
Oh, yeah, and I don't think that's an irrational fear at all. I think that's a real, genuine fear, and I think that the reason why fundamentalism remains as popular as it is within American Christianity is that it has a security about it. There's a kind of an intellectual clarity that you take the Bible, you affirm it, and if something doesn't agree with the Bible, you simply reject that. And your epistemology then is very, very simple, and you kind of know exactly where you stand on all kinds of things. And so you can answer questions about gay marriage, about the role of women in society, about slavery, and about the age of the earth, and so on. You can answer all those questions by simply saying, well, if it's in the Bible, that's where I stand. And it is a very real slope that you get on. I mean, once you move away from that, then you begin to say, okay, this isn't literally true. Mm-hmm. So they're obviously borrowing local scientific ideas, which we now recognize aren't valid anymore. So this is not technically correct, and then that brings you to the next question, and then you say that's not technically correct, and so there's a whole set of challenges that evangelical Christianity simply has not wrestled with yet. I mean, the reason why we have liberal Christian denominations like the Episcopalians and so on is that they wrestled with these things in the 19th century, and they recognized that the traditional picture that that existed at the time of Martin Luther, for example, that traditional picture, like we can no longer hold those views. I mean, we just can't. So, I mean, you're either not going to be Christian at all, or you're going to have to be some more liberal kind of Christian.
But of course, it's the liberal denominations that are losing members for the reasons you suggest. I mean, there isn't the clarity and the simplicity of faith.
Yeah, so there is an erosion of faith going on there. However, there's a very interesting dynamic going on now, and we're going to need, I think, some historical hindsight to assess what's really happening right now. But the decline in the membership in the more liberal denomination has been arrested partially by refugees from evangelicalism. You know, I attend a more liberal Episcopal church now, and a significant fraction of the congregation are refugees from evangelical churches, including several from the church that I used to attend on the campus of Eastern Nazarene College. So there's a very real sense in which people who would like to remain a part of the Christian community in some sense, but can't stay within evangelicalism, find a home in a more liberal tradition.
And on this slope we talked about, is it possible to say where you are on it now? I mean, what ideas, maybe including ideas you formerly believed, have you given up? What Christian ideas do you not subscribe to? I mean, Christian ideas in some Christian tradition, and what do you still believe? I mean, you don't have to be any more forthcoming than you feel comfortable with, obviously. But.
Well, I mean, I get that question fairly often. I mean, people get kind of suspicious when you leave your your tradition after kind of a half century, as I did. But one of the things which I have welcomed about moving to Stonehill College, a kind of a liberal Catholic college in the Holy Cross tradition, is that you don't have to have clear answers to all of those questions. I mean, there's a sense in which being open and being on a spiritual journey is kind of it has its own integrity to do that, to be honest with yourself, to be willing to hold things in judgment for a while until you sort of think it through. And so I feel like I'm in a process now, kind of thinking things through. One of the things which I have been wrestling with a lot, and I may try to write a book about this at some point. But there's a sense in which when you are a member of a community with a very sort of rigorously well-defined set of beliefs, like your membership in that community helps you to stay intellectually in that in that world. So it's not merely that you have social bonds, but the social bonds that you have with your worshiping community creates an encouragement for your intellectual commitments to sort of stay with that community. Mm-hmm. And I found that when I was sort of released from the burden of needing to kind of keep convincing myself that evangelical theology was true, that it was somewhat liberating to be able to say, okay, now I really want to be able to think not what do I need to believe because I'm in this community, but how does the world look to me now? And so I'm in a sort of transitional process now, and the short answer to your question is I don't know exactly what I think about all those things, but I feel liberated in not being sort of forced to be affirming a certain set of positions. Mm-hmm. And this journey that I've had is very much the commentary that a lot of young people are making. I mean, there's this dramatic exodus of young people out of evangelical Christianity going on today. There's much hand-wringing and books about it and conferences and all that. There's the growth of this sort of quasi-religious group that they're calling the Nones, the Nones. Mm-hmm. And these nuns have some popular figures that are kind of their gurus and Pied Pipers, people like Rob Bell and Rachel Held Evans and so on. And the message is kind of the same, that these young people are saying, we don't want to be a part of a tradition that doesn't let us think, right? We want to be able to think secular thoughts if we want. We want to be able to say, really, Jesus rose from the dead? Did that really happen? Virgin birth? Did we really need that? All these miracles, did they really all happen? We want to be able to ask those questions and not sort of have somebody treat us as if we've just announced that we have cancer and need to be prayed for.
And are you talking about people who are still in some broad sense in a Christian framework, or just or are they more like what you would call spiritual but not religious?
That's the sort of the challenge of figuring out what this demographic really is. Now, many of those people will say that describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, but quite often what they mean is that I don't sort of sign onto the dotted line with all of the beliefs that I was raised in, but I still consider myself a Christian, and I'm just kind of thinking all of this stuff through. I mean, I would say a lot of my students at Stonehill College are in that mode. I mean, most of them are raised in sort of middle-class Catholic homes, and they went to catechism as children and so on, and now they're college age, and they're getting to sort of think things through. And there are very, very few of them that say, I reject my childhood faith, but there are a lot of them that say, like, I'm searching now and I don't know where I'll end up.
And do you have an idea about what is the kind of minimal belief you have to call yourself a Christian? I mean, in your view, or in the view of these young people you're talking about, like, at what point, what belief is it, the surrendering of which would lead them to go, okay, I'm not even a Christian anymore? What's kind of the last thing to go?
Well, I think if someone were to say that I think the teachings of Jesus that one should love your neighbor as yourself, that's just nonsense. That we live in a dog-eat-dog Darwinian world and we should look out for ourselves. I don't see how you could appropriate the label Christian if you went to that point. But if I encounter someone who said, I think of myself as a Christian, I don't actually believe in God, I don't know whether the historical Jesus is clearly presented in the New Testament or not, but I think this idea that the teaching that we must love our neighbor as ourselves, I think this idea is more than just a winsome way to interact with other people. There's something profound and deep and cosmically true about that, and I'm going to embrace that as the central organizing principle of my life. I mean, I would not tell that person, no, you can't be a Christian if you hold that belief.
So Sam Harris could be a Christian.
Yeah.
He'll be happy to know that.
Yeah.
Hear that.
Yes. Yeah. Let Sam know that.
I'm going to send him an email right after this. Okay. Now, so evolution. Seems to me challenges do arise if you're a Christian and you really grapple with the implications of the idea that we were created by natural selection. And the first of those is that, I mean, if you're a Christian in the sense of at least, still believing in God in some sense, then it seems that you have to conclude that the instrument by which God created humankind was natural selection, which is first of all, it's it only magnifies the problem of evil when you look at how much suffering and death and so on went into the process of creation, right? The price of the creation by natural selection is that a lot of organisms bite the dust and often in painful fashion. And there are a lot of such questions, right? But I assume you've thought about this a fair amount, right? How you work the fact of evolution into a theology.
Yeah, I mean that's where I think the hardest questions are being explored now, and that kind of is at the root of the guy that got fired from Calvin College. I mean, that was kind of what he was exploring there, and I think. I think the one major way that my thinking has changed over the past 4 or 5 years, say since I wrote Saving Darwin, for example, is I'm no longer convinced that what we've been calling theistic evolution or evolutionary creation is actually a viable concept anymore. I mean, there has been this rather heroic effort to try to find some way, some vantage point from which we could view natural history and say, this is God's work in nature as he is creating life and eventually human beings. Mm-hmm. But nobody has been able to do that. And a lot of effort has been expended, and a lot of, there's been a lot of straws that people have grasped at. I mean, Simon Conway Morris, as you know, he has this idea of convergence, that there's kind of like built-in niches in the world, and evolution kind of moves toward them and finds them. And so on.
Well, that by itself is not a crazy idea. I think he's right about that. I think there are a number of. E.O. Wilson, who is a flat-out atheist, I think, believes that the evolution of intelligent life was likely, and I think that's what Morris is trying to get at. Is arguing that look, the evolution of this kind of intelligent, morally interesting form of life was kind of built in, at least probabilistically, into the process of natural selection. So that part, I think that part is something he can plausibly argue. Where do you think he runs into trouble?
Well, I think you run into trouble when you try to sort of take that paradigm and say, therefore, we can conclude that this process of evolution is God's method of creation. I mean, I think it's when you make that theological leap and you go from making the claim that evolution does have some sort of teleological dimensions to it, which I think is what you are referring to there, and kind of what you argued in Nonzero. I mean, I don't have any problem with evolution having some teleological dimensions to it, but when you look at the overall process with the important role played by extinction, for example, and so on, and you say, okay, now that we understand that there's some teleology there, this is how we know this is God's method of creation. I mean, the traditional understanding of a loving creator who would minimize the suffering in the world and not put anything bad in the world that wasn't sort of intrusive from outside. I mean, that traditional theological picture, which is the evangelical view of God as creator, that's just hard to, I think, square with what we know of natural history.
Okay, but doesn't that give Christianity a big problem? And just to be clear, that's not the argument I made in Nonzero. I did say that evolution is directional in the sense of being likely to have created intelligent life, and moreover, it was a directionality that in some sense was suggestive of purpose. In other words, it seemed like, conceivably the system could have been set in motion in some sense with the purpose of creating intelligent life, just through the materialistic process of natural selection. But that said, I think people who do want to go at it from a specifically Christian vantage point, I mean, what is the alternative to arguing that that natural selection is the instrument of God's creation? I mean, if you want to hang on to the idea of a God that is responsible, that imbued the human species with purpose, and that's certainly part of Christianity. If you want to hang on to that, it's part of a lot of religions. If you want to hang on to that and accept natural selection, how do you avoid saying that natural selection was the instrument of God's creation? I grant that it creates problems, but what's the alternative?
Well, I don't think there is any alternative. I mean, the alternative, and this is what I think some thoughtful people within the evangelical conversation are pointing out now, is that evolution really needs to be understood as a special case of the problem of evil, and
right,
and the problem of evil is considered to be an insoluble theological problem.
Right.
I mean, there's a kind of simple-minded fundamentalist version where the Earth is 10,000 years old and Adam screwed it all up at the beginning, and that's the end of the conversation. But the more serious conversations about that make no attempt to sort of dissolve the problem of evil, to get rid of it. You just say, like, this is a mystery of faith, and
right.
People are told, when you get to heaven, ask God why things are this way. And so nobody, for example, tries to figure out how the Holocaust fits into God's plan, right? I mean, there's no sort of theistic genocide explanation for the Holocaust. It's a horrible evil, and people who believe that God could have stopped it and didn't have no explanation for that, no adequate explanation. So if natural selection is just the same sort of thing, then we're going to have to say, yes, somehow God chose to bring life and humans into existence in this particular way. It certainly looks like a messy, sinister way that in some ways maximizes suffering, and we don't know why God did it that way.
Right. And in that sense, I mean, natural selection, along that dimension, I think natural selection doesn't fundamentally complicate things, just in the sense that, look, the problem of evil was a huge problem before you'd ever heard of Darwin. It's still a huge problem.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And, that's why I would say, that doesn't make things any worse for a Christian theologian in at least that particular sense. I guess.
The point though is that it's a terrible, horrible intellectual challenge to sort of put that on the table. I mean, that's what anybody who wants to advocate for evolution has to do. And at the same time that you're trying to argue for that, you have the young earth creationists on the other hand saying, look, God created the world perfect. Human beings were not meant to die. Every animal was herbivorous. There were no sharp teeth, no thorns, no disease. Like none of those things were in the original creation. And then when humans sin, that's when everything happened that's bad. And so you can look at nature red in tooth and claw, and you can say, yeah, okay, that it wasn't the way God planned it. Like God did not sort of intend there to be saber-toothed tigers with sharp teeth. Adam caused the saber-toothed tiger to have sharp teeth. Right. So you've got a nice explanation on the one hand there. It's just wrong, but it's a nice explanation. And so to some degree, if you want to convince people that something that we call theistic evolution or evolutionary creation is true, you have to juxtapose it with that. Like you have to say, okay, that view is wrong, this young earth creationist view. Here's another view. And the other view is so repellent that people just don't want to have anything to do with it.
And just to be clear, does theistic evolution mean to you what I might use the term deistic evolution for? In other words, the idea that a God just set natural selection in motion and then kept hands off. It wasn't constantly intervening to create new species. It's just a process that once it starts, it goes of its own accord? Or is theistic evolution different from that?
No, theistic evolution would say that God is somehow involved in the process, and that the theistic evolutionists have to try really hard to push back against the idea that they're really just deists, and that's been the challenge, to try to come up with some theologically and scientifically plausible way to distinguish theistic evolution from deism, and that I think has been a failure.
Yeah, I would think that is a challenge. I guess one thing that I mean, there is a sense in which natural selection kind of complicates the problem of evil, and it gets back to your book. And here's something that your book made me think, is that I was asking, so in what sense is there a notion of original sin just in Darwinism, in Darwinian evolution? And there is one sense which, evolution explains why all of us are born with a sinful nature, or to put it more clinically, and with an inclination to do the things that Christians define as sin. Natural selection explains why we are born with that inclination. The difference between that and the way Paul handled original sin is, Paul has this thing where it's the humans who screwed it up. And whereas if you believe in natural selection, it's hard to imagine animals, having evolved without a sinful nature, because there's so many zero-sum games in the course of natural selection in cases where it's so much about the self. Although it turns out, we can also explain certain forms of altruism and so on through natural selection, but still, it's what you can't say from a Darwinian standpoint as far as our sinful nature goes is, well, everything was going fine, and then we started making bad decisions, right? Or one human made a bad decision and cursed the rest of us, right?
Yeah, you can't say anything even remotely like that.
Yeah, and that's, I guess that is a theological downside. I mean, I guess what you could say is, if you're going to stay within a Darwinian framework, and let's take a deistic, scenario where some God or somebody starts natural selection going, is that in the universe we're in, there's no other way to create life or something, But of course, then you're giving up on the idea of an omnipotent God, I guess, in some sense, right? A God that's working under metaphysical constraints in creating life is not an omnipotent God. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, that's kind of the whole, that was the whole controversy that was settled by the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. I mean, there was a belief in the first few centuries of Christianity that maybe when God was creating the world, that he was using pre-existing material, and this pre-existing material had evil properties, and so God had to kind of realize his creative intent but it was constrained and limited by the raw material that he had to deal with. Now this is a view that has some support in the scriptures, because the idea that God created out of nothing, that's not actually in Genesis. And if you translate the early part of Genesis quite literally, you say, like, in the beginning, when God began to create, the earth was without form and void. And so there's an implication there of a pre-existing material. And Hebrew scholars will tell us this was kind of the ancient worldview, that they didn't have a concept of bringing things to existence out of nothing. The idea was you took something that was there and you formed it and you imposed order on it, and so on. You drove back chaos. So this idea that God can create sort of out of nothing means that God can do exactly what he wants. He doesn't have sort of existential constraints based on his raw material. Now, once we get to natural selection, it's awfully hard to see how you can have anything that looks even a little bit like creation ex nihilo there, because, I mean, as soon as life gets started, the next life form depends very strongly on the previous one.
Oh, sure. Okay, well, we've talked quite a while, but there are a couple of, I could talk all day about this because it's a really interesting book. A couple of specific questions I wanted to touch on quickly. One is just, what did Augustine add to Paul's conception of original sin? St. Augustine is probably the thinker most famously associated with the doctrine of original sin. What's the difference between the way he looked at it a few centuries after Paul and the way Paul had looked at it?
Well, some people would say, I mean, your biblical literalists would say there's no difference. Augustine is just reading Paul carefully and exegeting him accurately. But I think what is a more fair assessment would be to say that Paul was ambiguous, and Augustine put an interpretation on Paul that read our modern doctrine of original sin back into Paul's writing. Augustine doesn't invent original sin out of nothing.
No.
He certainly refers to Paul, and he's not challenging Paul at any point. He's simply saying, look, this is what Paul meant when he said sin entered the world through Adam. He didn't mean that just, okay, this was the first time someone committed a sin, like the first home run in a new ballpark or something like that. He meant that the world has fundamentally changed now. A world without sin now has sin present in it, not just as a historical incident that occurred, but actually sin is now kind of ontologically and present in a very real way. So Augustine sort of clarifies the ambiguities in Paul for the Western Church. And the Eastern Church doesn't follow after Augustine, but our conversation in the United States is based in the Western Christian tradition.
Yeah, and it is interesting that a lot of that survives the theory of evolution. In other words, yes, we are born with an inclination to do these things that are considered sins, and we do inherit it. It does go back to the beginning of the human lineage. So the key difference is it wasn't just that one of our ancestors slipped up. It was really built into the process of creation, according to Darwinism.
Yeah, and I think that's a profound insight. And I mean, I try to end the book on a bit of a kind of hopeful note there by sort of noting that this sort of central Christian idea that human beings are flawed in some deep and inescapable way, that this is validated by evolution. The modern science is in total agreement with that, and I think in a way it's kind of unfortunate that we don't spend more time thinking about how we might structure society to kind of be a little more cognizant of our potential to do wrong in that way.
Yeah, and I'm a big advocate of using evolutionary psychology in the service of edification. So far, I haven't convinced many people of the importance of this. Final question. You point to the phrase, the famous phrase in Genesis, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's the tree the fruit came from. That's just always fascinated me as just so kind of mythically rich. Do you have a sense for why that's there? I mean, in the sense of like what? I mean, you note that the Israelites, I think you believe that this idea, or at least the Israelite version of this story, stories like this are found elsewhere in the Middle East, but their version of the story I think you believe emerges during the Babylonian exile and is allegorically an explanation of how they had been expelled from their Eden. But you also you underscore that phrase, the knowledge of good and evil, and I'm wondering if you. I've always just wondered what they were getting at. I mean, what the authors of this story were getting at with that. Do you have a thought on that?
I mean, I don't think there's any sort of simple answer that this is exactly what everybody thinks is the case there. But what is true about that story in Genesis, and this is particularly true if you go back and you try to read it kind of in isolation from later interpreters. I mean, that's a very ambiguous story on so many levels. I mean, like we've decided that, Christians decided that the serpent was Satan, but there's no real license to do that in the text. And in some ways, the serpent is the one who's telling the truth. I mean, the serpent says, look, God says you're going to die if you eat that fruit. You're not going to die, right? But what happens when they eat the fruit? Like, they don't die, right? So you have to kind of reinterpret what die means there to sort of get God off the hook for misrepresenting the consequences of that. There's also this interesting discussion about like the differences between the gods and the humans, right? And so the serpent is saying, look, God knows all this stuff. God knows about good and evil, and you don't, right? And this is why he doesn't want you to eat this. He doesn't want you to be like him. He doesn't want you to kind of have this exalted special knowledge and so on. But why wouldn't you want that? Why wouldn't you want to be like gods? And so then God gets angry, not because they sinned, but because they arrogantly presumed to acquire knowledge that was supposed to be only for the gods.
But moral knowledge is kind of a burden, in answer to your question of why you wouldn't want it, right? I mean, and, to constantly be scrutinizing your own behavior in terms of whether it's good or bad and that can be reinforced by a religious upbringing, by the way, but that can be a burden. And I think in the Genesis story, right, it's only after they eat the fruit that suddenly they're like, oh, we should be ashamed of being naked, right?
That's right.
This is uncomfortable.
Yeah, it turns out
there's a kind of self-consciousness
yes.
that, in fact, is just a property of being a human, I think. I mean, that's what's kind of being explained here. And I think of that as one thing that's being explained. Being a morally self-conscious being, which is kind of the human condition, and the suffering that can bring, however redeeming it can be in the long run.
Yeah, no, I mean that's absolutely true, and I mean that's why children run around laughing all the time, and old people don't.
Right.
I mean it's a great burden to carry the knowledge of right and wrong with you, and so there's a loss of innocence that comes with the knowledge of good and evil.
Well, it's a great story, and I encourage everyone to read your book, Saving the Original Sinner, if they want to know more about it. There's a whole lot of dimensions we didn't have time to get into. I mean, you do the whole history of ways this has been treated in Christianity and roles it is fulfilled. You get into how it was used in the slavery debate. The idea of Adam was used in the slavery debate and so on. Really interesting story. And thanks for taking the time, Carl. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Bob. I enjoyed the conversation.
Okay, well, take care.
Yep, bye.